All right, today we're jumping into a really big topic. We're talking about a philosophy that's designed to be a complete worldview, a lens for understanding, well, everything. From nature itself to the sweep of human history. We're talking about dialectical and historical materialism.
Right off the bat, you need to know this isn't presented as just some theory. The source describes it as a total worldview, a complete lens for how to see everything. And it's really built on two core components. So, let's get into it.
Okay, so here's our game plan. We're going to start with the big picture, this idea of a philosophy of everything. Then we'll dig into its two main parts, the dialectical method and the materialist worldview. After that, we'll see how those ideas are applied to create a theory of history, and finally, we'll look at the 5 stages of society that this theory outlines.
So, first, let's just talk about the sheer scope here. This isn't just a political theory or an economic one. No, it's presented as a framework for explaining, well, everything. Literally, from a single grain of sand all the way up to the grand sweep of human history.
Okay, so to understand what dialectics is, the text explains it by showing us what it's not. And its opposite is what it calls metaphysics. The way it's laid out is pretty clear. Metaphysics sees the world as a bunch of separate, static things, just kind of sitting there, unconnected. Dialectics, on the other hand, sees everything as a connected, coherent whole that's in a constant state of movement and change.
So that leads to the obvious question, right? How does this dialectical method actually work? Well, the source breaks it down for us into 4 key features.
And here they are. You've got universal connection, perpetual motion and change, something called quantity into quality, and finally, the struggle of opposites. Let's take a quick look at each one.
So that second principle is all about perpetual motion. The idea is that nothing is static, ever. Everything is in a constant state of flux. It's always coming into being, developing, and then eventually passing away. This quote here from Engels really drives that point home, this idea of ceaseless, unremitting change.
Now, this next point is absolutely crucial, because it's not just that things change, but how they change. And it's not a simple, smooth process. Think of it less like a ramp and more like a staircase. You have all these small, slow, quantitative changes building up, and then, bam, you hit a tipping point, and you get a sudden, radical leap, a qualitative change.
The text gives us a perfect classic example. Heating water, right? You raise the temperature by 1 degree, then another. Those are all small quantitative changes. The water's getting hotter, sure, but it's still water. But when you hit that magic number, 100 degrees Celsius, it doesn't just get a little hotter. It makes a leap. It fundamentally transforms into something new. Steam. That's the qualitative change.
Okay, so what's the engine driving all this change? According to this philosophy, it's the struggle of opposites. It's all about internal contradictions. You can think of it as a constant battle inside everything between what's old and dying and what's new and emerging. This internal conflict, this tension, is what powers the whole process of development.
All right, so that's the dialectical method. That's the how. Now let's look at the other side of the coin, the materialist worldview. This is the what of the whole philosophy. And just like before, the text defines materialism by putting it up against its opposite, which is called idealism. And the whole thing really comes down to one fundamental question. What comes first, the chicken or the egg? Or in this case, matter or consciousness? Idealism says that consciousness, ideas, the spirit, that's what's primary. But materialism flips that completely. It says, no, the material world is real, it's objective, it exists outside of our minds, and it is what's primary.
And this famous quote from Marx just perfectly sums it all up. It is not the consciousness of men that determines their being, but on the contrary, their social being that determines their consciousness. To put it simply, our material conditions, how we live, how we work, that's what shapes our thoughts and ideas, not the other way around.
So what happens when you put these two giant ideas together? You take the dialectical method, this engine of change through contradiction, and you apply it to the materialist worldview, which says our material life is what's most important. Well, what you get is a powerful theory of history.
And this is what the source calls historical materialism. The absolute key concept to grasp here is the mode of production. You can think of it as the economic foundation, the bedrock of any society. It's all about how a society produces the stuff it needs to survive, food, shelter, you name it. And the theory argues that this economic base is what determines everything else that's built on top of it. The political system, the laws, the social institutions, even the dominant ideas of the time.
So, this mode of production isn't just one thing.
It has two parts that are constantly interacting. On one hand, you've got the productive forces. That's the tech, the tools, the machinery, the factories, and of course, the people who have the skills and knowledge to use all that stuff. And on the other hand, you have the relations of production. This is the human side of the equation, the social structure. Who owns the tools and factories? Who works for whom? This is what defines the class system.
And this is where it all comes together in one massive claim. The idea is that the entire sweep of human history is really just the history of these modes of production developing and replacing one another. Each system comes into being, grows, but then its own internal contradictions start to tear it apart. Remember that struggle of opposites? That's what happens here. Eventually, the tension becomes too great and the old system is overthrown, making way for a new one.
So, based on this idea, the text outlines 5 distinct stages that society has moved through in history.
And you can see the whole historical timeline laid out here. It starts with what's called a primitive communal system. Think early human societies, where things were owned and worked in common. Then, according to the theory, this gives way to a series of societies built on class division. First the slave system, then the feudal system, and then the capitalist system. The final stage, it predicts, is a socialist system, which is described as a return to social ownership, but on a much more advanced technological level, and supposedly free of exploitation.
So all of this leaves us with a really big, thought-provoking question. If history is really driven by these vast, impersonal material forces, by the mode of production, then where do we fit in? What does that mean for the role of our ideas, our choices, and the actions of individual people? How much are we really in the driver's seat of history?